A complete fantasy story. The ballroom glittered with 10,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, each flame a tiny star suspended above a sea of silk and velvet. Alara stood just inside the entrance, her borrowed gown suddenly feeling threadbare despite its delicate lacework, her rehearsed smile faltering before it could reach her lips. She wasn't supposed to be here alone. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, hand-delivered by a servant in the Ashworth family livery. Lord Cedric Ashworth requests the pleasure of your company at the autumn equinox ball. Alara had stared at those words for a long time, understanding immediately what they meant. Cedric wanted her there, not out of kindness, but as proof. Proof that she had been forgotten. Proof that he had moved on to better things. Proof that his new fiancée, Lady Marguerite, had won. Won what, exactly, Alara still couldn't say. There had been no competition, no battle for Cedric's affections. There had only been 3 years of quiet courtship, gentle promises whispered in garden alcoves, and then one morning a letter explaining that circumstances had changed. His family had arranged a more suitable match. He hoped she understood. She had understood perfectly. She simply hadn't mattered enough. Now, standing at the threshold of the most prestigious gathering of the season, Alara felt the full weight of her miscalculation. She had come because refusing would have been its own kind of surrender. She had come because some stubborn part of her heart insisted that she walk through that door with her head held high. But she had not anticipated how vast the ballroom would feel, how many faces would turn toward her, how quickly the whispers would begin. Is that the Thornwood girl? Alone? Poor thing. Did no one warn her? Cedric's new fiancé is here somewhere. This should be entertaining. Alara's fingers tightened on the fabric of her skirt. She could leave. She could turn around right now and disappear into the autumn night, and by morning, the gossip would fade into other scandals. But her feet wouldn't move. Some impossible pride kept her rooted to the marble floor, even as her chest constricted with the first tremors of panic. It was then that she noticed him. He stood alone near the western windows, a still figure in a room full of motion. While nobles swirled and laughed and clinked glasses of champagne, he remained perfectly motionless, watching the proceedings with an expression of ancient patience. His clothing was impeccable, midnight blue velvet with silver threading, but there was something about the way it hung on his frame that suggested he wore formal attire as a concession to mortal customs rather than personal preference. The Vampire King. Everyone knew who he was. Aldrich Voss, Lord of the Northern Reaches, sovereign of a kingdom that existed in perpetual twilight. He had ruled for 6 centuries, outliving empires and prophesies alike. He attended mortal gatherings occasionally, no one knew why, and when he did, the other nobles kept their distance. Not out of rudeness, but out of primal, instinctive fear. He was dangerous. That much was certain. The kind of dangerous that didn't need to prove itself, that simply existed like gravity or the tide. Alara should have been afraid of him. Instead, watching his solitary stillness, she felt an unexpected kinship. He was alone too. surrounded by hundreds of people, and utterly, completely alone. The thought that followed was reckless, desperate. The kind of idea that only crystallizes when a person has nothing left to lose. Before she could talk herself out of it, Alara crossed the ballroom floor. The crowd parted around her without conscious thought, nobles stepping aside as she approached the vampire's corner as though some invisible current pushed them back. By the time she reached him, a small circle of empty space had formed, and Alara became acutely aware that dozens of eyes were tracking her progress. She stopped a few feet away. He didn't turn immediately. His gaze remained fixed on something beyond the window, the gardens, perhaps, or the distant mountains where autumn had already painted the peaks with frost. "Your Majesty," she said quietly. He turned then, and Alara's breath caught. His eyes were crimson, the color of wine held up to candlelight, but they held none of the predatory intensity she had expected. Instead, there was something curious in his gaze, something almost gentle. "You know what I am," he observed. His voice was low, resonant, like distant thunder heard through rain. "And yet you approach." "I know what everyone says you are." Alara clasped her hands together to hide their trembling. "I don't know if any of it's true." A faint smile touched his lips, not mocking, but genuinely amused. "A reasonable distinction. Few make it." He inclined his head slightly. "What brings you to my corner of solitude, miss?" "Thornwood. Alara Thornwood." She drew a breath, steadying herself. The words she'd rehearsed during her walk across the ballroom suddenly seemed absurd, but she had come too far to retreat. "I have a request. It's strange, and I have no right to ask, but I'm going to ask anyway." He waited, patient as stone. "I just need a fake boyfriend for tonight," as she whispered, her voice barely steady. "Stand beside me. Pretend. Just until midnight. That's all I ask." For a long moment, the Vampire King simply studied her. Alara felt the weight of centuries in that gaze, felt herself being catalogued and considered. She waited for the rejection, for the cold dismissal, for the polite suggestion that she had lost her mind. Instead, something shifted in his expression. Something that might have been recognition, or perhaps sorrow, flickered across his features and then settled into quiet resolve. "Why?" he asked. Alara almost laughed. She had expected many questions, but not that one. "Because the man I thought I would marry is here tonight, with his new fiancée, and every person in this room is waiting to see me humiliated. Because I can't leave, I won't give them that satisfaction, but I can't do this alone either." She met his eyes, refusing to look away. "I know how it sounds. I know you have no reason to help me. But you're the only person in this room who doesn't owe anything to anyone, and that makes you the only person I can ask." The Vampire King was silent for so long that Alara began composing her apology, her graceful exit, her retreat into the night. But when he finally spoke, His voice was gentler than she had anticipated. "You approached the most feared being in this kingdom," he said quietly, "and not to beg for your life or bargain for power, but to ask for company. Because you were lonely and afraid." Ilarar's throat tightened. "Yes." A slow, knowing smile curved his lips. The music seemed to dim around them as crimson eyes studied her, not like prey, but like a puzzle he'd waited centuries to solve. "Then I'm yours," he replied smoothly, offering his hand. The first gasps began before they reached the dance floor. Ilara heard them ripple through the crowd like stones dropped in still water. Whispers sharpened into hisses, fans snapped open to hide moving lips, and somewhere across the ballroom, a champagne glass shattered against marble. Aldrich guided her through the sea of shocked faces with an ease that suggested he had navigated far more hostile territories. His hand at her waist was cool but not cold, steady but not possessive. When they reached the center of the dance floor, the musicians faltered for a half-beat before recovering, launching into a waltz with slightly trembling fingers. "They're staring," Ilara murmured. "They always stare." Aldrich's voice was calm, almost wry. "Usually from a greater distance. This is rather more intimate attention than I typically receive." Despite herself, Ilara felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Does it bother you?" "I have been stared at for 600 years. I've learned to find it mildly entertaining." His eyes met hers, and again she was struck by their unexpected warmth. "Does it bother you?" Ilara considered the question honestly. The whispers were louder now, the pointed glances more obvious. Somewhere to her left, she could feel Cedric's gaze burning into her back. "Less than I expected," she admitted. "Is that strange?" "No. I suspect it means you've realized something important." Aldrich guided her through a turn, his movements precise and graceful. "The opinions of people who wish you harm have no weight. They are noise, nothing more." It was such a simple thing to say. And yet, hearing it spoken aloud by someone who had undoubtedly faced centuries of judgment, Ilara felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she hadn't known she was carrying began to unravel. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "That I needed help, I mean." "You could have refused." "You should have refused." "I'm nobody important." Aldrich was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, edged with something ancient and weary. 300 years ago, I attended a gathering much like this one. A young man approached me, a servant, barely more than a boy. He asked if I would help him escape from a lord who treated him cruelly. I could have refused. I should have refused. Instead, I intervened. He paused. "Do you know what I learned that night?" Ilara shook her head. "That sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is ask for help. And sometimes, the most important thing a powerful person can do is say yes." His eyes met hers again, steady and sincere. "You reminded me of him." not in circumstance, but in courage. The night wore on, and gradually, the staring became less sharp. The whispers softened into murmurs, the murmurs into quiet speculation. Aldrich stayed by her side through conversation after conversation, his presence a calm shield against the worst of the social cruelty. When Lady Marguerite approached with Cedric on her arm, Ilara felt her stomach clench. But before she could speak, Aldrich stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and the approaching couple. "Lord Ashworth," he said mildly. "Lady Marguerite." Cedric's face had gone pale. Whatever cutting remarks he had prepared seemed to wither in his throat. "Your Majesty, I didn't realize you and Miss Thornwood were acquainted." "Indeed." Aldrich's tone remained pleasant, but there was something beneath it now, something that suggested vast depths of patience held carefully in check. "Miss Thornwood has been kind enough to keep me company this evening. I find her conversation refreshing. So many people in this room speak only in pleasantries and facets. She speaks truth." Marguerite's perfectly arranged smile flickered. "How charming." "Yes." Aldrich's crimson gaze swept over them both, gentle but unflinching. "I imagine truthfulness is charming to those who recognize its value." The silence that followed was heavy. Cedric opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally managed a stiff bow before retreating into the crowd with Marguerite clutching his arm. Ilara exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to do that." "No," Aldrich agreed. "I wanted to." "Why?" He considered her question with the same patient thoughtfulness he had shown all evening. "Because unkindness offends me. I have lived long enough to see what cruelty does to both its victims and its perpetrators. I have no desire to witness more of it when I can prevent it." As the clock crept toward midnight, the ballroom began to thin. Nobles departed in carriages and coaches, their gossip no doubt already spreading through the city. Ilara and Aldrich found themselves standing by the same western windows where they had first spoken, watching the moon rise over the frost-touched gardens. "I should thank you," Ilara said quietly. "For tonight. For all of it." Aldrich turned to face her, and in the moonlight, he looked less like a centuries-old king and more like someone who understood loneliness intimately. "No thanks are necessary. I believe our arrangement was mutually beneficial." "Was it?" Ilara tilted her head. "What did you gain from this?" He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before, touched with something she could only describe as vulnerability. "I have ruled for 600 years. I have watched kingdoms rise and fall, attended 1,000 gatherings like this one, and been feared at each of them. Tonight, for the first time in perhaps a century, someone asked me to simply be present. Not as a king, not as a monster, but as a companion." He met her eyes, and there was nothing ancient in his expression now, only honesty. "Do you understand how rare that is?" Ilara's throat tightened. I think I'm beginning to. You approached me because you were lonely and afraid, he continued. What you did not realize is that I was lonely too. The distance people keep from me, it protects them from their fears, but it also isolates me from everything I once loved about existence. Conversation. Connection. The simple comfort of standing beside another person without them calculating whether I am about to harm them. I wasn't afraid of you, Ilara said softly. Not really. I was afraid of everything else, the whispers, the judgment, the memory of being cast aside. But not you. I know. Aldrich smiled then, and it transformed his face. The ancient weariness lifted, replaced by something gentle and almost hopeful. That is why I said yes. The clock struck midnight, and the last of the candles began to gutter out. Servants moved quietly through the emptying ballroom, gathering abandoned glasses and straightening displaced chairs. The night was ending. Ilara knew she should say goodbye. Their arrangement had been clear, just until midnight, nothing more. But standing here in the moonlight, she found that she didn't want the moment to end. What happens now? Ishi asked. Aldrich considered the question. That depends entirely on what you want to happen. I will not presume, Miss Thornwood. You asked for a companion tonight, and I was honored to provide that. Anything beyond this moment is yours to decide. It was such a careful answer. Such a respectful one. And somehow, that respect meant more to Ilara than any of Cedric's flowery promises ever had. I don't know what I want, as she admitted. Everything feels uncertain. But I know that tonight, for the first time in months, I felt safe. I felt seen. She hesitated, then continued. If that's all this ever is, if we never speak again after tonight, I want you to know that it mattered. You mattered. Something shifted in Aldrich's expression. Not surprise exactly, but something deeper, a kind of quiet wonder that made Ilara realize how rarely anyone spoke to him with genuine feeling. I have lived a very long time, he said slowly. I have learned that the most meaningful moments are often the smallest ones. A kind word. A hand extended without expectation. A stranger choosing trust over fear. He reached out then, not to touch her, but to offer his hand once more, open-palmed, an invitation rather than a demand. Whatever the future holds, Miss Thornwood, know this. You have reminded me tonight why existence is worth enduring. That is a gift I did not expect to receive. Ilara looked at his offered hand. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, the pain of Cedric's abandonment, the terror of walking into that ballroom alone, the desperate courage it had taken to approach a legend. And she thought about what she had found instead of humiliation: kindness, presence, understanding. She placed her hand in his. Perhaps, as she said quietly, we could simply begin with this. With trust. And see where it leads. Aldrich's fingers closed gently around hers, not possessive, not demanding, but steady. Warm despite everything the legends claimed about his kind. "I would like that," Ihi replied. Outside, the autumn night was cool and clear. Stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust, and somewhere in the gardens, a nightingale began to sing. The ballroom behind them was nearly empty now, its glittering cruelty fading into silence. Elara walked beside the vampire king toward the garden gates, neither of them speaking but neither needing to. Some things didn't require words. Some connections simply existed, recognized and accepted, without the need for explanation. She had come to this ball expecting humiliation. She had found instead something far more valuable, a reminder that kindness could appear in the most unexpected places, that strength often looked like gentleness, and that the bravest thing anyone could do was reach out when they were afraid. At the gate, Aldrich paused. "May I see you home?" Elara smiled. "You don't have to." "I know." His crimson eyes held hers, warm and sincere. "But I would like to." She nodded, and together they stepped into the night, not as a fake couple playing a desperate game, but as two people who had found in each other something they hadn't known they were missing. The whispers would continue, Elara knew. By morning, half the kingdom would be spinning wild theories about the vampire king and the unremarkable woman he had chosen to accompany. But standing here beneath the stars, with Aldrich's steady presence beside her, she found that she no longer cared what anyone else thought. Some things mattered more than gossip. Some things mattered more than pride. And sometimes, the most terrifying night of your life became something else entirely, a beginning, soft and quiet and full of hope. The nightingale's song followed them down the cobblestone path, and overhead, the moon cast silver light across a world that suddenly felt a little less cruel, a little more possible. Whatever came next, Elara knew one thing with certainty. She would never again underestimate the power of reaching out, of asking for help, of trusting that somewhere in the darkness there might be someone willing to say yes. And as Aldrich walked beside her through the autumn night, unhurried and patient, she understood that he had given her something far more valuable than protection. He had given her hope.